Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today we're tackling how teachers are prepared for those rural, regional, and remote schools.
Those are some really tough placements to fill.
They are, but with a twist, a global one at that.
Ooh, huh. Sounds interesting.
We're going international with this one.
I like it.
So we'll be looking at an academic paper
Okay.
that digs into a teacher training framework, a framework all the way from Australia.
Australia, huh? They do have a lot of remote areas.
They do, lots of experience there, right? But here's where it gets really interesting.
So I'm listening.
The author of this paper, he actually used this framework to navigate the challenges of running a school in Qatar.
Wow. Qatar, that's quite a jump, geographically speaking.
It is. Different world, different continent even.
So how does an Australian framework fit into a place like Qatar?
That's what we're going to find out. It really speaks to how universal some of these principles can be.
I'm intrigued.
Let's set the stage first. Back to Australia. They have a strong commitment nationwide to quality education.
They do. They put a lot of emphasis on equity in education.
Exactly. And that goes for even the most remote areas.
Makes sense. Every student deserves a good education no matter where they live.
Absolutely. And they even developed these national professional standards for teachers.
Right. I've heard of those.
Yeah.
They're pretty comprehensive, cover a lot of ground.
They aim to ensure that all students, and especially those in disadvantaged areas,
Okay.
are getting the best education possible.
Admirable goal. And I'm guessing those standards are constantly evolving as well.
They are trying to keep up with the times. But even with these high standards in place, they realized something was missing.
What's that?
Teachers, they weren't being specifically prepared for the unique challenges.
Oh, yeah, those can be quite different from, say, teaching in a big city.
Huge difference, night and day, really. They needed something extra, something more.
So what did they do?
Enter the TERR network.
The TERR network.
Stands for Tertiary Educators, Rural, Regional, and Remote Network.
Catchy acronym.
They came in to fill that gap. They created a framework specifically to address those remote teaching challenges.
Like a specialized toolkit for those educators.
Exactly, a toolkit full of strategies and insights.
I like that analogy.
So, what exactly is in this toolkit? What does it focus on?
Well, it covers 7 key areas.
7. Okay, lay them on me.
Things like understanding how remoteness impacts learning.
Right, because it's not just about the distance.
No, not all.
Got all these other factors.
Exactly. Then there's teaching students from diverse backgrounds, because you often find a really interesting mix of students in remote areas.
Right, from all walks of life.
And of course, working closely with parents and communities, building those relationships is essential.
Oh, absolutely, especially when you're in a smaller, tighter-knit community.
You become a part of the fabric of the place.
So it's pretty practical, hands-on stuff.
That's the idea. It's all about giving teachers the skills they need to thrive, to really make a difference.
I can see how that would be valuable no matter where you end up teaching.
You'd be surprised how many of these skills translate to other contexts.
So this brings us to Qatar, right? Our author, he was a school leader in Dukhan.
Dukhan.
It's a remote oil and gas town.
Not exactly the Australian outback, is it?
Completely different. Now, when we think remote, we often picture, well,
Wide open spaces, isolation.
Exactly. But Dukhan is a different kind of remote.
How so?
It's a remote in terms of limited access.
Limited access. To what?
To things you'd typically find in a big city, like specialized services, support networks, all sorts of resources.
Interesting. So not isolated geographically, but isolated in terms of resources.
You got it. A different kind of isolation, but isolation nonetheless.
Yeah, I see. So what kind of challenges did this create for the author?
Well, let me tell you, he faced some very specific hurdles. Ones that, and here's the kicker, align perfectly with those 7 focus areas of the Australian teacher training framework.
Wow, really? That's fascinating.
It is. It shows you how these principles can be applied in all sorts of unexpected situations.
So a framework designed for, say, a tiny schoolhouse in the outback could actually be relevant in a bustling oil town in the Middle East.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond the surface, finding those common threads.
I'm curious, what were some of the specific challenges the author faced?
Well, for starters, the state oil agency, QP, pretty much ran the whole town.
QP.
Yeah, and that included the school.
So the school was tied to the oil industry.
Very much so. Things like teacher recruitment and getting resources.
Well,
Those were often at the mercy of QP's business needs.
Not necessarily what was best for the school.
You hit the nail on the head. It wasn't always about what the students or teachers needed.
That must have been frustrating.
It was trying to create a stable learning environment when so much was out of your control.
And this ties into the first area of that TEAR framework, right?
It does. Understanding the broader context of remoteness.
Seeing how those external factors, those economic and political forces, can really shape things.
It's not just about what happens in the classroom. It's about the whole ecosystem the school is a part of.
You're right, it's much bigger than that.
Now imagine trying to implement a student-centered curriculum.
The kind that encourages critical thinking and independence.
That's the one. But in a community where some parents might be more used to, let's say, a more traditional approach.
More teacher-led rote learning.
Exactly. Different expectations, different ideas about what good education looks like.
That could lead to some interesting conversations.
It did, but it highlights another key area of the framework.
Which one is that?
Teaching students from diverse backgrounds in a remote context.
Ah, yes, because in Dukhan, you've got students from all over.
Over 30 different countries, a real melting pot of languages and cultures.
So the author had to adapt his teaching, be sensitive to all those different needs and backgrounds.
It was a juggling act, for sure.
Sounds like the framework provided him with some useful guidance.
You could say that. It's about flexibility, understanding that one size doesn't fit all.
Makes sense, especially in a place as diverse as Dukhan.
And then there was the communication aspect, don't forget that.
Oh, right, because over 85% of the students didn't speak English as their first language.
Huge challenge right there.
Imagine trying to communicate effectively with all those families.
Well, it gets even more complicated.
How so?
The school, they had this policy.
What kind of policy?
All parent communication, everything had to go through the author.
Through him. Why?
To avoid misunderstandings, especially given all the language barriers.
Oh, I see. It was an attempt to control the message, make sure things were clear.
Exactly. But can you imagine trying to build trust
And strong relationships.
under those conditions?
Sounds like a recipe for communication breakdowns.
It could have been, but the author, he was determined to make it work.
So this ties into the framework's emphasis on engaging with parents and communities.
Big time. Building those bridges, finding ways to connect despite the barriers.
You know, it's funny, you might think a section on, say, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students wouldn't apply in Qatar.
Right, completely different cultural context.
But if you look closer, that section, it emphasizes some pretty universal things.
Like what?
Building trust with communities who may have had negative experiences with formal education systems.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Understanding the impact of historical context. Respecting cultural differences.
Those are important everywhere.
Exactly. So even though it was written with a specific population in mind, those core principles, they resonate much more broadly.
So it's not just about ticking boxes. It's about applying those deeper understandings to any situation.
Adaptability, nuance, that's what makes this framework so fascinating.
It speaks to the challenges and rewards of teaching in any environment where resources might be limited, diversity is high, and relationships are paramount.
You've got it. It's about being a skilled and dedicated educator, no matter the setting.
So what we're learning here is that remote doesn't always equal geographically isolated.
It's a much broader concept.
It's a whole set of circumstances that create unique challenges for educators.
And this framework, as Australian as it is,
Yeah.
it offers valuable insights, tools that can be applied globally.
Okay, so we've talked about Australia. We've gotten taste of the author's experience in Dukhan.
A good overview.
But I'm ready to dig in to really see how those 7 key areas of the TEAR framework played out in his day-to-day life.
Let's do it. Let's unpack those 7 areas and see what lessons we can draw from them.
Starting with that first one, understanding the impact of remoteness on student learning.
Buckle up. It's going to be a fascinating ride.
I'm ready for it. So that first area of the framework, understanding the impact of remoteness on student learning.
Right, and we're not just talking about geographical remoteness here, are we?
No, not at all. Dukhan might not have been in the middle of nowhere,
Literally.
but it was definitely isolated in its own way.
Okay, so remind me, what were some of the key challenges in Dukhan that really impacted the students?
Well, remember how the oil company, QP,
Yeah, the one that practically ran the town.
their influence sometimes led to teacher shortages.
Oh, right, because they were calling the shots on things like staffing.
And there were often delays in getting essential resources.
Because the school's needs weren't always top priority for QP.
Exactly. So you've got teachers who are trying their best,
To provide a good education.
but they're constantly dealing with these disruptions.
Lack of staff, missing resources, It's like trying to build a house without the right tools.
And then you factor in the language barriers, the diverse cultural backgrounds.
It's a lot for any teacher to handle.
It really is. And that's why this first area of the framework is so important.
It's about understanding the bigger picture, right?
Right, recognizing that these external factors,
Things that are often beyond the teacher's control.
they have a huge impact on the student's learning experience.
So it's not enough to just be a good teacher. You have to be a problem solver, too.
You have to be adaptable, creative, think on your feet.
Sounds like you need a whole other set of skills.
You do. And that kind of leads us into the next area of the framework,
Which is?
learning in the remote context.
Okay, what's that all about?
This one gets really interesting because it deals with those potential clashes between different educational philosophies.
Like what the teacher believes is best practice versus what the community might be used to.
Exactly. You've got the author, he's coming from a system that really emphasized student-centered learning.
Giving students more agency, right?
Right, encouraging critical thinking, independence, all that good stuff.
But then he lands in a community where some parents might have a completely different idea about what good education looks like.
And they did. Some parents were more accustomed to that traditional teacher-led approach.
Rote learning, memorization.
That's it. It's a classic example of those cultural differences we were talking about.
I bet that created some interesting conversations.
You can say that again. Parents questioning the methods. Teachers trying to explain their approach.
And the framework, how does it address this?
It stresses the importance of understanding the community's educational values.
Okay, so doing your homework, getting to know the context you're walking into.
And then finding ways to bridge those gaps, to explain your approach in a way that makes sense to everyone.
So it's not about forcing your beliefs on anyone.
No, it's about finding common ground, building trust.
Respecting those different perspectives.
Exactly. And it's something that any educator working in a diverse context needs to be prepared for.
Because those clashes can happen anywhere, not just in remote areas.
You're right. It's a universal challenge.
So this framework, it's giving teachers the tools to navigate those tricky situations.
To create a learning environment that respects both the curriculum and the community's values.
It's a delicate balancing act.
It is. And it's not easy, but it's essential.
All right, so we've talked about those external factors, those different educational philosophies.
What's next on the list?
Well, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of teaching.
The actual classroom stuff?
Exactly. And this is where that diversity in DUCON really comes into play.
Oh, yeah. Remember, over 30 nationalities represented in the student body.
A huge range of learning styles, language abilities, cultural perspectives.
You name it, they had it.
It's like the United Nations of classrooms.
And the author, he had to find ways to reach every single one of those students.
That's where the next area of the framework comes in, right?
Teaching students from diverse backgrounds in the remote context.
Okay, so how does the framework help teachers in that situation?
It emphasizes the importance of differentiated instruction.
Tailoring your teaching to the individual needs of each student.
Exactly. Having a whole toolbox of strategies.
Being able to assess those needs, to adapt your approach on the fly.
It's about recognizing that what works for one student might not work for another.
And in a classroom as diverse as DUCON's, that flexibility was crucial.
Absolutely. And then there's the language piece. We can't forget about that.
Right, because the majority of the students were non-native English speakers.
Over 85%, can you imagine?
So not only are you dealing with all those different learning styles and cultural backgrounds,
You're also trying to teach in a language that many of your students are still learning.
that's a whole other level of complexity.
It is. And it highlights the need for those strong language acquisition support strategies.
Making sure those students feel supported, that they can participate fully in the classroom.
Creating that welcoming and inclusive environment.
It sounds like the author had his work cut out for him.
He did. But it's amazing to think about the impact a skilled and dedicated teacher can have in that kind of setting.
It really is. It's about going above and beyond, finding creative solutions.
And the framework? It provides a roadmap for that, a way to navigate those challenges.
Okay, so we've covered the external factors, the different learning styles, the language barriers.
What's next?
Well, now we're going to dive into a section that might seem a little out of place at first glance.
Out of place?
It's called Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students.
Wait a minute, I thought we were talking about Qatar.
We are. But stick with me on this one.
Okay, I'm listening.
So, obviously there weren't any Indigenous Australian students in DUCON.
Right, completely different cultural context.
But if you look closely at what this section of the framework emphasizes,
Okay.
it's about building trust with communities who who may have had negative experiences with formal education systems.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Understanding the impact of historical context, being sensitive to potential power imbalances.
Those are all relevant no matter where you are.
Exactly. So even though this section was written with a specific population in mind,
The core principles are much broader.
it's about recognizing that some communities might approach education with a certain level of mistrust, maybe even fear,
And it's the teacher's job to address that, to build those bridges.
to create a learning environment where everyone feels safe and respected.
It's a reminder that cultural sensitivity is not just about knowing the facts.
It's about putting those facts into action, building those genuine relationships.
And that's crucial in any educational setting, but especially in a remote context where those relationships are everything.
You're right, it's the foundation of a successful learning experience.
Okay, so we've talked about building trust, understanding different cultural perspectives.
What else does this framework cover?
Well, remember how we mentioned that there were very few professional development opportunities in Dukhan?
Yeah, the author was pretty much on his own.
And that's where the next area of the framework comes in.
Engage in professional learning in the remote context.
It's all about taking ownership of your own learning, even when those traditional supports aren't there.
So what does that look like in practice?
It's about seeking out resources, connecting with other educators online,
Building that network, even if it's virtual.
and it's about creating a culture of continuous improvement within the school itself.
Sharing best practices, learning from each other.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that professional development doesn't have to be this formal top-down thing.
It can be organic, it can come from within.
And in a remote setting, that kind of self-directed learning is essential,
It's about empowering teachers to be lifelong learners.
which is really what this framework is all about, isn't it?
It is. It's about giving teachers the tools they need to thrive, no matter where they are.
To be adaptable, to be resourceful, to be constantly growing and evolving.
Okay, so we've covered professional development. What's next?
Well, we're going to shift gears a bit now and focus on the community aspect.
Ah, yes, the importance of engaging with parents and the broader community.
And this is an area where the author really had to step up.
How so?
Well, remember that school policy about all parent communication going through him?
Oh, yeah, that sounds pretty restrictive.
It could have been, but the author, he saw it as an opportunity
An opportunity.
to ensure clarity, to avoid those potential misunderstandings that can arise when you have so many different languages and cultures in the mix.
So it's more about managing the flow of information.
Exactly. And it didn't mean he wasn't accessible to parents.
He still made himself available, right?
Absolutely. He went above and beyond, attending social events, utilizing the skills of staff members who spoke Arabic.
Making sure those language barriers didn't become insurmountable obstacles.
He was a visible presence in the community, always approachable, always willing to listen.
So he was embodying that principle of community engagement.
He was. And this is something the framework really emphasizes.
That in a remote setting, the school is often the heart of the community.
It's a gathering place, a source of support.
And the teacher's role, it extends far beyond the classroom.
It's about being present, being involved, building those relationships.
It's about being a part of the community's fabric.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered community engagement. What's the last piece of this framework puzzle?
Well, the final area focuses on the personal side of things.
The human element.
Exactly. It's called teaching and living in the remote context.
So it's not just about the professional challenges, it's about the personal ones too.
The joys and the struggles of making a life in a remote location.
And the author, he definitely experienced both sides of that coin.
What were some of the challenges he faced?
Well, he talks about the isolation he sometimes felt, being one of only a few Australians on staff.
Being far from home, far from your familiar support networks.
It can be tough, especially when you're adjusting to a completely new culture.
But he also talks about the rewards, right?
He does. He talks about the incredible personal growth he experienced, the lifelong friendships he formed with people from all over the world,
That sense of adventure, of pushing yourself outside your comfort zone.
and the unique perspective he gained by immersing himself in a different way of life.
So it was a trade-off, but ultimately a positive one.
It was, and that's something the framework tries to capture.
That teaching in a remote location can be incredibly demanding, but also incredibly enriching.
It's not for everyone, but for those who embrace it.
It can be a life-changing experience.
Okay, so we've now gone through all 7 areas of this teacher training framework.
And we've seen how they played out in a real-world context that's very different from the one it was originally designed for.
It's pretty amazing how relevant these principles are no matter where you are.
It is. It speaks to the heart of what it means to be a good teacher,
Adaptability, empathy, a commitment to lifelong learning.
and a genuine desire to make a difference in the lives of your students.
And while not all of us are going to end up teaching in remote oil towns or tiny outback schools,
Right, most of us probably won't.
I think there are some valuable takeaways here for any educator.
Absolutely. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has. But before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to turn the tables and ask you a question.
Okay, hit me with it.
Imagine you're tasked with designing a teacher training program specifically for educators headed to remote areas.
Okay, I'm game.
What key elements would you include to ensure they're well prepared for those unique challenges and rewards?
That's a great question, and one we'll explore in more detail after a quick break.
Stay with us. Okay, so we're back and ready to design that teacher training program.
For those brave souls heading out to those remote areas.
Right. Where would we even start?
Well, for me, I'd make cultural sensitivity training front and center, absolutely essential.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, but it can't just be, like a quick lecture on different customs.
No, we need to go deeper than that.
It's got to be about really understanding and respecting those different perspectives, like deep down.
Absolutely. I'm thinking immersive experiences, maybe bringing in guest speakers from various cultural backgrounds.
Oh, I like that, hearing those firsthand experiences.
Even simulations, where teachers have to navigate those tricky situations that require cultural sensitivity.
Putting those skills to the test in a safe environment.
Exactly. Because knowing the rules is one thing, but actually applying them, that's where the real learning happens.
And speaking of real-life situations, we can't forget about the communication piece.
Oh, huge one, especially in remote areas where you might have multiple languages and different ways of communicating.
Right. What might seem polite in one culture could be offensive in another.
It's those subtle things that can really trip you up.
And a simple miscommunication, it can escalate so quickly.
Absolutely. So in our training program, I definitely include modules on active listening, conflict resolution, strategies for communicating across cultures.
Like learning how to say no in a way that's respectful but firm.
Exactly. And maybe even have participants practice translating those important school documents or policies into different languages.
That's a great idea. Hands-on experience with those real-world challenges.
And we could bring in experts on language acquisition, to give those teachers practical strategies for supporting students who are learning English as an additional language.
That's essential. We need to make sure those students feel included, supported, and able to thrive.
Absolutely. Now, remember how we talked about self-directed learning? That's got to be a big part of the training, too.
Especially in those remote areas where access to those traditional professional development opportunities might be limited.
Right? They might not be able to just pop over to a workshop or conference.
So it's about giving them the tools to be their own teachers, so to speak.
To be resourceful, to seek out information, to connect with other educators.
We could incorporate modules on action research, peer coaching, online learning platforms specifically for those remote educators.
And a mentorship program. Wouldn't that be great?
Oh, yeah. Pairing those experienced remote teachers with those who are just starting out.
Sharing those hard-earned lessons, providing that support system.
Because sometimes you just need someone who gets it, someone who's been there.
Absolutely. It's about creating that sense of community, even when you're physically isolated.
And speaking of community, we can't forget about engaging with parents and the broader community.
Oh, that's crucial. We need to equip those teachers with the skills and knowledge to build those strong relationships.
We could incorporate modules on, let's see, community-based participatory research.
Where teachers work alongside community members, right?
Yeah.
To identify those local needs, develop curricula that are culturally relevant.
Exactly. And we could encourage teachers to learn about the history, the cultural practices of the communities they'll be serving.
To really immerse themselves in that local context.
And give them practical strategies for collaborating with families, especially those who might have different expectations about education.
It's about building those bridges, creating those partnerships.
It's about recognizing that parents are essential partners in the education process.
Absolutely. But let's be real. Teaching in a remote area, it's not always easy.
There are going to be challenges, moments of doubt, maybe even a little bit of loneliness.
So we need to prepare them for that too.
We can't just focus on the positive, we have to address the tough stuff as well.
Absolutely. We need to talk about things like isolation, burnout, the importance of self-care.
Maybe incorporate mindfulness techniques, stress management strategies.
Encourage them to build those strong support networks, both within their schools and beyond.
To reach out, to ask for help when they need it.
Because sometimes just knowing you're not alone can make all the difference in the world.
It really can. But even with all those challenges,
There are some incredible rewards, too,
We need to make sure those shine through in the training program.
to get them excited about the adventure that awaits them,
To show them that they have the power to make a real difference in those communities.
to connect with different cultures, to expand their own worldview.
To grow as both educators and as individuals.
It's about helping them see the bigger picture, the lasting impact they can have.
And who knows, maybe this deep dive will inspire some of our listeners to consider a career in remote education.
I hope so. It's a path less traveled, but it's one that can lead to incredible fulfillment.
So as we wrap up our exploration of this teacher training framework and its surprising global relevance,
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
what are your main takeaways? What's sticking with you?
For me, it's that reminder that while the context may be different, the heart of good teaching, it's universal.
It's about building relationships. It's about embracing diversity.
It's about approaching every challenge with creativity and compassion.
And never underestimating the power of education to transform lives no matter where you are.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up.
Well, that's another deep dive done and dusted.
Until next time.
Keep those minds curious and keep exploring the world of knowledge.